for coming back in. First, Claire, that was incredible, and I know how challenging that was for you to share such a personal story, but I really want to tell you how much we all appreciate that. A little personal story. When I talked to the intensive care doctor who was taking, who was taking care of Kara, he pretty much reached out to me sort of just as a formality because at that point he felt like the prognosis was grim, the bad, the worst. And that was actually the last time I heard anything about Kara for years. How many years? And to be honest, I assumed the worst. I assumed the worst. And then 6 years later, I heard from, I think, one of your friends, if I'm not mistaken, and like, what? So that was really incredible. And here we are. And this is a little something for you. Feel free to share with your 11 kid family. I know you pretty well, lady. All right, so what I was asked to do is just reflect a little bit on my journey that I've had as a physician and researcher. So this is nothing really scientific, it's very subjective. But what I want to do is kind of take you through some of the challenges that I have encountered and kind of share those experiences with you. I think I've belabored this point, but again, I am so grateful for so many different individuals and entities that have stepped up to allow me to be able to do what I do and also give me the opportunity to give back, like through these conferences. So someone just asked me this morning, how did I even get started? So here I am, a pediatric cardiologist interested in understanding mechanisms of some of the most complex heart defects, like some of your children have. Hi, Harlan, how are you? And so that particular heart defect is called a hypoplastic left heart syndrome. And it actually is the most common cause of death in all infants that are born with any kind of congenital heart defect. And so, unlike a lot of adult heart problems, very little is known about this particular type of heart defect. And yet we do a pretty good job, case in point, right? But if you ask, I would challenge you, Harlan, to ask your cardiologist, tell me what you know about the mechanism underlying the heart defect that I was born with. And you probably get a really blank stare. They probably, oh, Bruce, okay, I think I got very well. Bruce is the exception. He would tell you, go ask Grossfeld because he knows about this. But no, Bruce is fantastic. He's actually been very highly successful in understanding a different type of syndrome that you've probably heard of called Noonan syndrome. And they're actually like parallels. So that was, my goal of thinking that if we can really understand what's going on, just like high cholesterol causes heart attacks, or if we can understand the genetics and mechanisms of this disease, that maybe we can actually do a better job. And so this was the first paper that Dr. Jacobsen actually published back in 1973. And this is one of the first patients that was ever described by Dr. Jacobsen, who last I heard now is in his mid to late 60s, living in a group home in Copenhagen. And last time I heard, although it's been a while, he's doing quite well. So, gosh, I can't even read this from here. Let's see. I might have to come up to the computer here. Is it blurred or is it really?
It's good light.
Can we turn the lights down maybe? Because then that would be a little bit better to see. So what I'm going to show you is actually the first patient that I ever took care of with Jacobsen syndrome. Coincidentally, was in my first month of cardiology training, and he was born with a form of hypoplastic left heart syndrome. And I hypothesized then that because in his chart, I saw an actual paper copy of Dr. Jacob Jacobsen's first paper, that he was missing a chunk of chromosome 11. It didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that, well, maybe there's a gene or genes in there that's the cause. And so I went on to study as much as I can, and it turned out it was sort of a gift in terms of my being able to focus on a specific genetic cause or the potential for a specific genetic cause. And along the way, I learned that probably of all genetic syndromes, Jacobsen syndrome has the highest frequency, about 5 to even 10% of your children have been born with hypoplastic left heart syndrome. And even more importantly, there are about something like 2,000 babies born a year in the United States with hypoplastic left heart syndrome. And as you'll see in my talk on Wednesday, my hope was that not only was I hoping to learn about the cause in Jacobsen syndrome, but how that might relate to the other 2,000 or so kids that are born every year. And this is the first child that I saw back in July of 1995. And that's Edgar Ibarra. I don't think they made it today. I was hoping they would. And here he is more recently now. He is, whatever the math comes out to be, about 36 years old. He was born with a quite large deletion. And cardiac-wise, fortunately, he's doing quite well, although he certainly has a lot of the severe issues that can happen in Jacobsen syndrome. And so as part of my training, then I officially kind of started my research on Jacobsen syndrome a couple of years later after seeing that first patient in 1997. And it's been a journey. I like to show this picture because this holds true to this day, that it's a long series of wanderings, especially when filled with, sorry, I gotta look closely, with notable experiences and hardships, and I should say lots of incredible victories as well. So some of the challenges that I want to describe to you is when I first started, there actually had been a researcher who had given all these sort of false empty promises. And so when I first met actually with, at that time, Melanie Johnson, who, for those of you who don't know, she's the one who started this group back in the late 90s. There's kind of some baggage to overcome, right? Because there was a lack of trust. And who was I to come along, you know, and make my promise that I was committed to trying to learn this, but, you know, why should they believe or trust me? And so that was a big challenge. In April of 1998 is when I attended the first European conference. And that's when I got to meet a number of the families there that I'm still in touch with, including Annette Van de Toe, who is the president of the European Chromosome 11 group back then. And as I mentioned, I visited Melanie Johnson that same year, and that's when I learned about this previous researcher, Glenn Evans, who kind of abandoned ship shortly thereafter that, actually. So the timing actually was quite fortunate that there was this group in its sort of infancy that really didn't have any kind of a medical person to turn to, at least in the United States. So challenge two was, I knew about the cardiac stuff, but there were a lot of other problems that people would come up to me and ask me about. That was really kind of taking me out of my comfort zone. And so that's when I realized I needed to reach out to others in the field that could help me. And so the first person probably that I reached out to was a guy that some of you might know from the very earliest conferences, Chris Jones, who is at the Institute of Child Health at Great Ormond Street in London. And that led to my actually spending 3 months in London working in his lab 7 days a week to learn everything I could about Jacobsen syndrome and how I could use sort of the human genetics technologies to learn or hopefully identify the gene or genes that we think are now involved in causing the heart defects. And it was during that same time that I got to meet Teresa Matina, who at that time, I believe, did I see Teresa? There you are. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you at that time were the only MD in the world, maybe besides Marilyn Jones, who had published that paper. And as you know, I don't think I need to say anything more about Teresa's involvement with this. Now, interestingly, fast forward a number of years later, Ketty Parada was working on a PhD with Dr. Matina, and to my knowledge is the only person in the world who has earned a PhD specifically in Jacobsen syndrome.
Two?
Yes? Oh, there are three now. See, well, you'll have your, when you give your history talk, you can enlighten us on the other two. It was that same spring in 1998 that I met Dr. Remy Fabier, who is really the person that led to the discovery of the bleeding problem that you've already heard about. Remy is in Paris, and the name of the hospital is Trousseau Hospital for Children, and so that's why it's called Paris-Trousseau syndrome. I bet most of you did not know that story. And then knowing that probably the most ongoing concern for most of you families are the behavioral and cognitive challenges that your children face. And so I was able eventually to hook up with a couple of PhD psychologists in San Diego who, until their recent retirement, uh, helped us to do a lot of formal assessments to learn exactly what the kinds of problems are that your children have and to begin to identify some of the genes that we think, with the hope that maybe by defining those genes, we could even begin to come up with what we call gene-based therapies. And is Virgil here in the room yet? He's probably very jet lagged. I heard there was, yeah, so Virgil's flight is delayed, but actually it was my friend and colleague, Hal Hoffman, who is the now chief of allergy and immunology at Rady's, who had been to a conference and learned that at that time, about 10, 12 years ago, states were now beginning to do newborn screening for a type of immunodeficiency called SCIDs. And it turned out that several of those patients that came up positive for severe combined immunodeficiency also had Jacobsen syndrome. And so that led to one thing to another. And that's how we got Ken Paris involved, who is at New Orleans, and Virgil, who hopefully will arrive here sometime soon when you'll hear actually Virgil's talk on, what day is it? Wednesday? Tomorrow morning. Okay. Assuming he is. Okay. Another challenge was, here we are 13 conferences later, just the importance of organizing these conferences. But for me, it really gave me an opportunity, as some of you have already experienced today, just to meet with you one-on-one and to learn everything I can about your children and hopefully to give back whatever we know about your children and their specific problems. And so that's been incredibly satisfying, not to mention the wonderful friendships and relationships we've made over the years around here and throughout the world. So this is where we had our first conference in 1998. Were you guys at that conference? Yeah, so I think you're the only family here who can say that they were at the first conference 26 years ago now. Wow. So that was just a few miles south of here in Del Mar. So we had about 35 families. And again, that was an incredible opportunity for me to begin to learn about not just the cardiac issues, but many of the other problems. And that led a few years later to our publishing what today is still by far the largest prospective study on about 110 people with Jacobsen syndrome. Next challenge is to address maybe the things we'd like to avoid, but what have been traditionally the most common forms of mortality in Jacobsen syndrome. I think you already heard about one, the bleeding problems and brain hemorrhages. Infection is another big one, and congenital heart disease. And moving on to the next slide, thanks to an attorney that I got to know a number of years ago, Chuck Haymeyer, that some of you might remember. Chuck advocates for children and adults with rare diseases. And one of the things he's come up with was the recommendation of these medical protocols, which hopefully all of you are familiar with. And I think by getting those out there, we've got a long ways to now minimize the complications of bleeding and infection by raising awareness. And in fact, a medical protocol, if you hand that to your doctor, they're actually legally obligated to follow that. So what that leaves us with is still probably congenital heart disease as being the most common cause of death. So one of the other aspects of all this has been some of the incredible technological advances, and this is what was one of the early versions of what we call the microarray study. And what that allowed us to do is not just look at a gross sort of picture of chromosomes, but to actually define at the molecular level where your child's deletion breakpoint is. And that, combined with the Human Genome Sequencing Project, which was published, I think, in about 2001, allowed us to actually be able to pinpoint exactly which genes are affected. And from that, we could begin to predict potentially what kinds of medical problems your child may or may not develop in the future. There have been along the way some really incredibly informative patients. You could say the rarest of the rare. This is one little girl who was born in Denver. I'm hoping 2 years from now, her mom might be able to come give her next keynote speech, because her story is also one that's incredible. And actually, Sasha, kind of fitting the theme we've heard in some of the introductions, appeared very unaffected until you got to know her a little bit better. So she was born with hypoplastic left heart syndrome, and her deletion was actually quite smaller than any other one that we had ever come across previously with hypoplastic left heart syndrome. And so that allowed us to kind of refine or narrow down the area where we thought the genes were. These are a couple of siblings from the UK who were both born with the same deletion, inherited. Actually, it was probably from an unbalance. But anyway, long story short, I think you can see here, they look pretty different, and they were actually born with two different heart defects. And even though they had the identical deletion, and from that, we've been able to learn what we think is how even two different people with the identical deletion could have either no heart defect or two completely different heart defects. I'll talk more about that on Wednesday. This is Yuli Ziegler, that some of you may have known from back at the first, around the time of the first conference. She is from Denmark as well. She sadly passed away 10 years ago, actually almost to the day, from an infection of her heart called endocarditis. And that was another indication of the risk for infections and immunodeficiency in these children. And this is another actually very rare baby from upstate New York who had a very unusual type of chromosome rearrangement called an inversion. And if you look at this next slide, you can actually maybe see her normal chromosome 11, which is right there. And then here you see her affected chromosome 11. You see this extra little red signal. And basically, without going into details, that allows us to pinpoint where exactly we thought the disease-causing gene was. And that allowed us then to postulate this one gene called ETS1. So we reported that in 2009. And I'll talk more about that on Wednesday. One of the things that we have been able to do in terms of some of the really exciting technologies is to take cells from a patient and reprogram them to become different types of heart cells that are critical in heart development. And from that, we can actually begin to understand what are the fundamental processes that have gone wrong. And this was taken advantage of and culminated in a paper that we published just a couple of years ago, in which we showed that if we regenerated cells from the patient that have a type of heart defect that affects a population of cells called the neural crest cells, we could actually study and learn what the problem was using this technology. So that gave us some really important insights, which again, I'll talk more about on Wednesday, about how one of the functions of this gene is to regulate how these cells migrate from the central nervous system of the developing embryo to help to form certain structures of the developing heart. I don't think I need to spend any more time on this slide. I think Claire pretty much hit this one, but this is the paper that she was referring to, in which Kara was one of the 7 patients that we described in that paper. One of the other things we've learned, and this is really important for those of you like Carlin, who have had a child with hypoplastic left heart syndrome, every so often, I will get contacted by either a family that's been diagnosed prenatally or sometimes a surgeon or a cardiologist. And quite frequently in the past, because they know that there are potential risks, they will actually offer no treatment. And this is a little baby here in Southern California who has now done really well. That shows that, in fact, like some of you already know, that having Jacobsen syndrome in itself is not a deal breaker for proceeding with having heart surgery, even for the most complex heart defects, as long as you take into account things like infection and bleeding Crohn's. And this is the paper that we published to that. So I have emailed this paper many times now in the last several years to people around the world to show to their surgeons that, in fact, you can do this and do it quite well, actually. So I kind of talked about the behavioral problems, and we did have a really great team helping us to understand cognitive problems and behavioral problems to the point of being able to identify some of the genes. And this is one of the first papers that we published on that subject, identifying a couple of the genes. In fact, we just had a conversation this morning with one of the families that I met with, talking about how those 2 genes may impact their child's development. And this was an interesting situation back in 2004. The only family who I met originally back when they were living in Europe I think as many of you appreciate, your children tend to be very, very outgoing, which seems to be almost the exact opposite of what one thinks of when they think of autism. But Robin was actually diagnosed through a very comprehensive battery of tests with autism. So this was back in 2004, and that was the first time that I learned about autism. And in fact, we went on to find out it's actually pretty frequent. About 1/3 of all girls and 2/3 of all males fulfill the criteria for making that diagnosis. And so we published that, including identifying at least one gene in that region that we think can contribute. Ooh, this is too many words to read. So I'll just kind of skip on this to say that, unfortunately, Sarah and Natasha kind of retired and faded away. But one thing I would say is we have some very, very early sort of preliminary studies suggesting that there may be a couple of drugs that could be useful for certain aspects of behavior and cognition. One is the drug called clonazepam, which we have found in a couple of cases may help some of the really impulsive, outwardly aggressive behavior. The problem, though, is that once you're on that, oftentimes you develop tolerance to that class of drug, and then you have to get higher dosing, and then higher dosing brings on more side effects. So I don't think that's a good long-term solution, but it may be something worthwhile when there's a little short-term deterioration in behavior where like you're really in a desperate situation, so maybe sort of a little short course. The other drug is a drug called buspirone that might help for one aspect of cognitive functioning called daily life skills. We've had two people, Kalia and Sophia from the Midwest, who were on this drug for a variety of reasons and went through a whole battery of testing, and only daily life skills came up significantly improved in both of those individuals. So again, that's very anecdotal, but something that would be potentially worth exploring. Some of you might remember back in 2012 when we had Ken Paris, or actually it was Hal Hoffman, I think at the time, at our conference. We kind of went around the room like in this and asked every single family if your child has ever had significant infections. And what was overwhelming is that almost every child had a marked history of repetitive, recurrent, sometimes even life-threatening infections, which alone just making the clinical diagnosis then immunodeficiency. And so that you'll hear a lot more about tomorrow. And you'll hear more about some of the interventions now that Ken and Virgil have come up with that have literally been life-saving. So more recently, COVID has been a big challenge. And I'll just say this, that most of you, I'm sure appropriately, were very, very concerned about your child being exposed to COVID because of the concerns of the immunodeficiency. And we did actually measure the immune response to the COVID vaccine in a few kids with Jacobsen syndrome. And that turned out to be really liberating because what we were able to show is that, at least in a few cases, that those that we looked at, your child could mount an appropriate antibody response to the COVID vaccine, which was huge, because now you could let your kid come out of their bubble and actually interact, with the public and not worry about their inability to fight off the infection. So that was a really big step forward. Okay, so fundraising, as an aside, is always a challenge for anyone that's in the field of biomedical research. They understand. My lab budget is about $250,000 a year, which is pretty cheap when you think about it. That does not include any my salary, just for the two people that you met earlier today and all the supplies. And so I alluded to this before, what Craig and Rebecca did back when How I Met Your Mother was going full blast, and they actually had two fundraisers, if you have been there for those, on the set. And I think each one of those raised about $150,000 in one evening. So that was really amazing. So it's always a challenge to keep that going. You heard Elena's really great talk, and I think this is actually still a challenge. I always find it a little bit frustrating. I think we talked about this, Lindsay and Jessica, that how many times on the Facebook page do I see someone write in a question like, does your child bruise easily? Have you ever heard of a bleeding problem or something like that? And so I can't emphasize enough the importance of turning to that to our website that Elena pointed out earlier. I was actually really surprised when Lindsay just told me this recently that, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you said something like 80% of all of you who have had a genetic diagnosis at some point never even get to meet with a genetic counselor to go over those results. So no wonder why people don't know about this, because there's just not enough genetic counselors. So anyone who's thinking about a career, that's a great path to choose. So the information, unlike 25 years ago, is out there now. And so what we need to do is raise awareness so that people don't have to reinvent the wheel to get access to that information. And just to reiterate, what Elena did with Kelsey Bissinger was really a remarkable step forward to now give this information that's easily accessible, and you can download those papers and literally hand them to your treating physicians. Okay, just enough said, there's Elena. And I'm just going to end on maybe the most sobering part of all of this is the fact that we still have a lot of challenges ahead. And if you look at this picture, these are 3 babies that all passed away this past year in 2023 from complications from basically hypoplastic left heart syndrome or some form of it. So on the far left is Sophia S., who passed away at age 13 days in Dallas. Thor Griffin is in the middle. Sophia was from Dallas. Thor was from Pittsburgh. He went through multiple heart surgeries and passed away at about 9 months. And similarly, Sebastian on the right, Sebastian's family is still here. There they are, who went through another, again, a very painful process. But what's really incredible about these 3 babies is not just the tragedy of their short lives, but all 3 of those families donated their child's heart to my research. And we're just kind of starting the studies, but I can tell you that this gives us an unprecedented opportunity to learn something much more about what led to hypoplastic left heart syndrome. And so, you know, it's like, how do I even say thank you for what you've been through? That's I think the most noble thing. So we've lost direct people in our group with Jacobsen syndrome, and we've lost a few other family members. Some of you may know some of these people. Craig, Thomas, and Rebecca, within a few weeks of each other, Rebecca lost her dad, Paul Milkman, on his 80th birthday. 3 days before he died suddenly, among other things, he made a donation to my research. So basically one of his last things he ever did, literally on his 80th birthday, was to think about helping other people. And similarly, Nancy Sondag is actually Craig's stepmom, who just a few weeks later, similarly, just died suddenly. And also, one of the last things she did was to want to support my research. So they've been through a hard time, but we will sorely miss them. And then this is someone that we've already heard about, Patrick, who I think almost all of you who have been to previous conferences know Patrick. You may remember him dressed like this, but this is more what Patrick was known for. And I just always loved having Patrick come to our conferences because he just made it so much fun. And he was such a loving human being. And Tristan, you know, I think I don't have to tell you what an impact he's had and continues to have on your life. And I dare say that you are such an incredible human being and individual because of what your grandpa did and was so dedicated. I think music alone, you were exposed to Elvis Presley before you even could say a word. You didn't have a choice, but here you are. And I'll never forget at the talent show a few years ago, Tristan stood up like, here I am, and sang a song by heart. You know, just unbelievable. So Patrick is part of this group and you are his legacy. More recently, in the past couple of years, we lost 2 others that have been just really, really special human beings. These are Emmett Collins' parents from New Hampshire that many of you know. Brian and Diane, incredible, incredible human beings. Brian, among other things, ran the Boston Marathon something like 35 years, 25 years in a row. And so um, they'll be very missed as well. And I think lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge my own parents, who I lost about 8 weeks apart, coming up now on 10 years ago. But I know that if they could be here today, they would be just so excited and thrilled to see how all of you from so many different parts of life have come together and what a really special group you guys are. And I think for me, that's part of my parents' legacy, is for me to be part of your group. So thank you. Just to wrap up, I am always humbled to this day about how much there is to learn. This is our cat, Oliver, reading the New England Journal of Medicine. He's a very inquisitive cat. And one of my favorite actors, Alan Alda, who actually started an institute a number of years ago about how lay people, or actually how researchers and physicians and scientists can do a better job communicating with lay people. And I just want to read you what he says, because this is something I try to embrace. Real listening is a willingness to let the other person change you. When I'm willing to let them change me, something happens between us that's more interesting than a pair of just dueling monologues. So I love that quote. That's how we should practice medicine. And lastly, because I'm such a sports fan, many of you must know John Wooden, who I think was maybe the greatest coach of all time. And I love his approach, and that is make each day your masterpiece. I think this is almost my last slide. This was actually back at the conference a couple months ago in Germany. So I was again having one of these one-on-one meetings just in the courtyard there. And this is this little boy's mom. And he kind of, as I was talking to the mom, he kind of wandered off and I kind of lost track of him. And out of the blue, he comes back and he has this bouquet of dandelion flowers that he gave to his mom. Just such a spontaneous act of loving kindness. And I just think that picture really captures that, and it's so representative of your children. So I am done. So thank you. Great. Okay.